Good morning and welcome to this, our first session of our 2022 BSI Global Built Environment Summit, in which we'll be exploring a number of areas of interest to our sector under the broad heading of health, safety and welfare. For those of us that have not met before, my name is Ant Bird and I'm Head of Built Environment at BSI within the National Standards Body. And it's my privilege today to be your host for this morning's session. But before we get started, a bit of housekeeping first, if I may. As attendees are probably fully aware now with the volume of webinars that we actually host at BSI, this is actually a listen-only webinar, but it is being recorded. That said, we really do welcome your questions via the Q&A function on the box in the top right-hand side of your screen. I've already gathered a number of questions that attendees have already kindly submitted. So we do have a number of questions, but please, as presentations run today, do, if you think of them, submit your questions through the Q&A function. We have a number of great speakers today, and given how the day is going to run, and I'll take you through the agenda in a moment, we will take Q&A at the end of each speaker presentation, so we can keep it related to the presentation you have just seen. So do bring them forward. If you experience any technical difficulties, I'm sure you won't, famous last words, but please also submit your issue via the Q&A function, and the team that sit behind this at BSI will help get you sorted out and get you back listening and viewing the presentations today. Really important for us at BSI is that upon completion of today's session, and there'll be more sessions coming, but I'll touch upon that shortly, we really value your feedback. So if you could complete the survey, that will be really helpful. We'll do that via a link that we send out, and by the same token, ultimately you will receive a copy of the recording of this webinar too, that you can share with colleagues, etc. But just as far as feedback is concerned, first and foremost, we're here to support our built environment sector, and therefore, if there are areas that you wish us to explore in future webinars or thematics, please do not hesitate to come forward, and we can feed those into our programme of activity now, stepping forward to 2023. So really useful. Really useful for me too, given my various memberships. This is a CPD recognised webinar, and so please request your certificate via the feedback survey as well following completion of the webinar. So don't forget to ask. Okay, next slide please. So, as I say, we're here today and we're doing things slightly different. Typically, BSI have run a 1 or 2 day webinar end to end. But now this year, we're going to try something a bit new. We realise that we're dealing with very busy stakeholders, and we wanted to best fit so you can apportion your interest where it lay the most. So actually our summit over the next 2 days is broken down into 4 discrete sessions. Yes, health, safety and welfare today, but then this afternoon, my colleague Dan Rossiter will be hosting our cyber physical infrastructure session. Tomorrow morning, we have quality and value, hosted by another colleague, Ian Richardson. And then finally, tomorrow afternoon, colleague Claire Price will be hosting our modern methods of construction session. And I'll provide a link at the end of today's first session where you can click into those and join up to those if you so wish. So this session this morning has a focus on health, safety and welfare. It's fair to say that the health and safety aspects of the built environment sector are ever present in our national news, not least because of the Grenfell tragedy and the ongoing public inquiry. But by the same token, it's also hugely important that we continue to think about the welfare and well-being of the needs of people when it comes to the built environment too. And so today's agenda is going to cover that. Yes, there'll be a focus on the state of the nation. We'll be joined by our regulator. We'll hear firsthand from an expert in the field of construction products, but then we'll finish with a most timely presentation around inclusive design and what modern future inclusive design will need to include. However, that's enough of me. Let's get started. So if we can knock on the presentation for our first presenter. I'm really, really grateful that Hal has actually agreed to join us again for another BSI webinar. I know Hal's made the time because he's currently at Build to Perform Live at a CIBSI event in Excel, which I joined him at yesterday. So he's taken time out of his busy diary to come and join us for this piece this morning. I'm sure you all know Hal, but just to remind you, he is the Technical Director of CIBSI, the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers, the professional body for building engineering services. Hal leads the technical and policy development work of the institution with a particular focus on the building regs and building safety reforms and the adoption of digital information management. He currently chairs a number of BSI committees, for which I'm grateful. In fact, I've heard that number might have just increased. And in a personal capacity, he also chairs the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. Hal, thank you ever so much. The virtual lectern is now yours.
Thank you very much, and I'll reassure you, I've only been reappointed to the Digital Information Committee B555. It's not a new one. I don't think I've got an enthusiasm to take on another, but thank you for your kind words in the introduction. And yes, I have made the time to do this, and I've done that for a very specific reason. And that's because I think the topic, or at least part of the topic I'm going to cover this morning, is really, really important, and that is the building safety agenda. And I do have a concern that too few people in the industry fully understand the scope and the extent of the reform that is being undertaken. And I hope by the end of this session, everybody who's listening will have a better understanding of that, and also how it fits into the wider policy piece. So I think we all know that it's a time of unprecedented change in our sector. On top of all the things everybody's facing around energy prices and the cost of living and the availability of skills within our sector, we've got the Building Safety Act and the supporting regulations, and they are driving the most far-reaching review of building and fire safety legislation. And Andrew Moore will be saying more about that a little later, but I hope I can provide a curtain raiser. We are seeing greater digitalisation, modularisation and off-site fabrication, and these are government priorities. They are keen to push these, and indeed there are a number in the industry who are keenly adopting them, and we need to understand the implications of that in a number of ways. And then, as if that wasn't enough to be dealing with, we have climate change, we have the Climate Change Act, and we have the changes to building regs that has stimulated for Part L, energy efficiency, for Part F on ventilation, which I think has just been thrown into even sharper focus by the tragic incident that's hit the headlines in Rochdale, with a boy of just 8 days more than 2 years old dying as a result of the mould in his home. And the coroner's report is very clear that the home was not adequately ventilated. So Part F is a really critical thing. We have the new Part O on overheating, and we have Part S dealing with electricity.
Thank you, Christos. Yes, we appear to have Hal back online. So if we kind of go back to his last slide. Hal,
brilliant, thank you, Ant.
I'm here, Ant. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do apologise for that. It was the IT. I have no idea what happened or didn't happen. I'm just going to have to go really fast. You're going to get the slides and you'll have the recording. So we have the Building Safety Act. The Act makes some fundamental changes to the Building Act 1984, and it provides enabling powers that will permit the Secretary of State, currently Michael Gove, to introduce a wide range of new regulations to implement the various aspects of the Act. and I will go through them in a little more detail shortly. We also have the building regulations, and they will be part of the implementation package. And of course, we have a net zero carbon related policy. There might be some uncertainty about what that looks like right now, given some of the announcements of the last month or two. But I think we have the Climate Change Act. That is an act, it's there. We have a net zero target. It's just not clear how we're going to get there yet. But we think that the Future Home Standard, the Future Building Standard, which are currently under development, will help us to get there. And then we have other policy drivers. We have things like the Construction Playbook, Constructing the Gold Standard, the Transforming Infrastructure Programme. All of these are playing out. We have modern methods of construction, about which a lot more in the final session. And then this afternoon, we've got a session on physical and cyber security. These are all areas where there is a real push to develop quite significantly in the industry. And we have DEFRA developing a timber and construction roadmap. There is a great deal going on in addition to the Building Safety Act. Just very briefly, given the little hitch, we've just in the last year had new versions of parts F, L, O, and for charging S, and we need to get to grips with them. And as I say, we have the net zero work. We have the 6th carbon budget. We're going to be looking at the 7th carbon budget soon. That work on that is already beginning. And this is going to set challenging targets for our sector, not just for new build, but we do have the small matter of 30 million or so buildings. And if we're going to be net zero carbon by 2050, many of them are going to need significant refurbishment to make them net zero. And that all has to happen alongside the building safety reforms. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we have the Construction Playbook, which is guidance to government departments. There is a private sector version of this, which has just come out, with a great deal of guidance on how both public and now private sector contracts ought to be organised to be more efficient, to give better value for money. And in I think it was May of last year, David Mosey produced Constructing the Gold Standard, giving some independent guidance on how public sector construction frameworks should operate. We have the emphasis on modern methods of construction and factory prefabrication, and that throws up a whole host of challenges all of its own. And we also have the UK BIM framework, in which BSI has been a key participant, along with the UK BIM Alliance, as it has formerly been known. It's recently rebranded as NEMA, which is the Greek for thread, and I think reflects the key role of digital information as a thread through much of what we do in the construction sector. The UK BIM framework has been developed over many years to help us to implement digital standards and methods of working in our sector. And then there is some other relevant legislation, the Health and Safety at Work Act, the workplace regulations, the CDM regulations. We're well used to them. They've been managed by the HSE, and perhaps they give us a clue as to what the new regime might look like when the HSE steps in as the Building Safety Regulator. And the key thing is that all of these make people responsible for their actions and their omissions. And there's a clear emphasis on risk assessment and risk-based prioritisation. And that, again, I think is set to spread into the Building Safety Act area as well. So one final initiative, which I want to mention, is the Code for Construction Product Information that has been developed. The Construction Products Association have done a lot of work on this, but have also involved others, because They are very mindful of the concern about marking their own homework. And the code sets some very clear standards for the development and the handling of construction product information, which I think is going to be very important as part of the response to Grenfell. So all in all, there is a great deal going on in our sector, and a lot of it will impact many of us. So very briefly, just to remind ourselves how we got where we are, we had the independent review of building regulations and fire safety, which was triggered by the Grenfell Tower tragedy. We had a competence steering group set up to look at competence across the sector, which produced Setting the Bar, setting out a range of recommendations around competence, and that indeed is picked up as a key element of the new regime and a key responsibility of the Building Safety Regulator. We've had the Grenfell Tower inquiry. The hearings have now ended. I would recommend that anybody who hasn't heard the closing remarks of counsel to the inquiry, Richard Millett, it is worth going to their website and downloading what he had to say, because it gives some indications of where the inquiry may be going. And I have to say is somewhat depressing. As Mr. Millett himself says, at the beginning of the inquiry, he described much of what was going on as a merry-go-round of blame passing. And he observes that he sees an awful lot of that still going on several years later. And that is a challenge for us all. And as I say, I would recommend that people are up to speed on Mr. Millett's closing statement. But in addition to that, we've had Dame Judith's review, and she identified 4 key issues: an ignorance or misunderstanding of regulations and guidance. What are we meant to do? What have we got to do because it's a requirement? What is guidance? Where does that guidance apply and where does it not apply? A view that there's indifference to quality and safety. It's all about speed and cost. A lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities. Hence, we have the duty holder regime that is coming in, and some of the other responsibilities being placed on specific people. And Dame Judith was also clear that there is a lack of regulatory oversight and enforcement. I might come back to that a little later as well. So, and there's also perhaps a lack of consequences of non-compliance. The government has been very clear. It's accepted all of Dame Judith's findings. It's passed the Fire Safety Act. The Building Safety Act is now law. They are in the process of setting up the new Building Safety Regulator. And I do want to stress that this is for all buildings. It's not just about higher risk buildings. The view that the Building Safety Act is a response to Grenfell Tower. Grenfell Tower was a tragic event in a block of flats. Therefore, the Building Safety Act is all about blocks of flats. It's not. That is nonsense. The Building Safety Act is about all buildings. There are some specific additional requirements relating to higher risk buildings, and people do need to be aware of that. We are going to get a new regime for construction products. There is a new competence framework coming in with specific regulations likely to cover competence and duty holders, but I don't want to steal Andrew Moore's thunder, nor do I want to pretend that I know the full story either. It's still evolving, but we're going to have to be much better at demonstrating competence in the industry. And actually, this slide is slightly out of date. The consultations closed last month, and the department are now analysing the responses. But there's a great deal of detail in those consultations. If you're not familiar with it, I would strongly encourage you to be. The Fire Safety Act means that external walls and fire doors to individual flats are now included in fire risk assessments. They're part of the common parts of a building, and there are various new legal duties around that, which those who deal with those things need to be aware of. This piece of legislation came in last year, and it's been implemented through regulations this year. And there are further regulations coming into force on the 23rd of January next year. BSI have, at government's behest, produced PAS 9980 on fire risk appraisals, which again, anyone involved in that sort of work needs to be up to speed on. We're going to get a load of secondary legislation because that is the way that the Act has been structured. And actually, there's a very positive reason for that. It means that if regulations need amending, it will be much less difficult to amend regulations than it is to amend primary legislation. One of the reasons the Building Act got so out of date was because all the requirements were in the primary legislation and it was just too difficult to change. Building Safety Act is a very big piece of legislation, and I'm going to give a brief summary of it in a minute. But what else do we know? Well, we know that work is now underway. We've had the consultation that ran until the 12th of October, and we know that draft regulations are being prepared. The engineering profession has already set up a competence framework for engineers that is specific to higher risk buildings, and that is going to be launched next year, and it deals with facades within the structural group. BSI has now developed publicly available specifications for competence, and they're listed there. And they have a BS Flex, which provides the overall framework for these competence schemes, and that is currently being updated to a full British standard. We know that those who operate higher risk buildings will need to have safety cases and safety case reports. And again, that's going to apply to new and existing higher risk buildings. So those who manage HRBs that have been built a while ago, they still need to get their heads around it and work out how they are going to respond. And the Engineering Council is looking at its licensing arrangements and may well introduce the requirement in due course for chartered engineers to be revalidated at regular intervals. 5 years has been suggested. So there's quite a lot going on in addition to the implementation of the Act. I just want to stop very briefly and remind us that a higher risk building means a building in England that is at least 18 metres or 7 stories high and is of a kind described in regulations. Now, the reason for doing it that way is that you can amend the regulations to bring additional buildings within the meaning of higher risk. We believe that in the first instance, it will apply to any building that meets the height threshold with 2 or more residential units, and also hospitals and care homes. But in the case of hospitals and care homes, it will be during design and construction. In the case of residential, it will be throughout the life of the premises. So moving on, why higher risk buildings? Well, we all expect to be safe in our workplaces. So why shouldn't people have a right to be safe in their homes? And that was very much one of Dame Judith's themes, and I won't dwell on it, but it is worth bearing in mind that that was something Dame Judith emphasised, and that the need for a risk-based approach was very much in her thinking, and we can fully expect that to be worked out as the new regime is brought into place. If we want to know how the new regulator is going to work, we ought to look at how the HSE works, because the new regulator is sitting within the HSE. It's likely to operate in the same way. And it's worth noting that Part 4 of the Act applies to higher risk buildings in operation. We've extended building legislation into operation there for the very first time. Now, I'm going to have to go very quickly, but you will have these slides to look at later. And it's important to say the primary aim of the Building Safety Act is to remedy the systemic failures that Dame Judith identified and to create greater accountability and responsibility, to give residents a stronger voice, to protect leaseholders, and it also extends the scope of the Defective Premises Act. And overall, there is a desire to drive culture change in the industry. And it also provides a clearer framework for construction products. Now, I'm not going to go through this in huge detail, but the Act comes in 6 parts, and it contains a lot of technical provisions relating to building regs, as well as provisions relating to the costs of building remediation. And moving very swiftly through, part 1 is an introduction and scope and explains what the Act is doing. And as often happens with legislation, there are a number of secondary things tucked in there that government has wanted to do and has used the Act as a means to do it. Worth saying that much of the Act only applies to England, but some of it applies to England and Wales, and some of it, particularly construction products and architects, applies to the whole of the UK. Part 2 establishes the new regulator and committees and powers. So that's where the Building Safety Regulator comes in. And once up and running, it will have 3 new advisory committees, and the current Building Regulations Advisory Committee will be abolished. One of the consequences of this is that the department will be left without an independent scientific advisory committee. The regulator is going to have various duties. It will have oversight of the whole building control system, and that means both private and public sector building control inspectors, and all aspects of building work will be within their remit. They will be setting the standards and operating a register for building inspectors, and they will be overseeing the new enforcement regime, which includes the potential for criminal sanctions and extends the time limits for enforcement action from what we have had up until now. And they also have a duty to oversee competence requirements. And again, that's for work on all buildings. It's not just HRBs. Part 3 is a major revision of the Building Act, and there is a huge amount of detail there, and it has effectively updated the Act and also introduced a significant number of new provisions that will enable the regulations that are coming and will support the work of the regulator. And if you want to know what building work is, please go and look at Regulation 3 of the building regs, because it's set out there. As I've already explained, Part 4 deals with higher risk buildings in occupation. So it's not just new build, it's all of them, and there are about 12,500, we believe, and they are all going to be under the oversight of the regulator. We've done the bit about higher risk buildings, and it will apply throughout their life, and there will be an accountable person who must be appointed for every higher risk building. I mentioned construction products, and there's been a lot of talk about product safety, and the bill provides powers to require construction products to be safe, to create a list of safety critical construction products, and it also brings in new liabilities on materials producers for defective products. And this all sits on top of the current regime, and indeed there is a new regulator in the Office of Product Safety and Standards, the OPSS, and that sits within BAYS, but again it will be answerable on policy for construction products to DeLuc. And there are also some building liability orders tucked in there, which I would recommend that product manufacturers are aware of. And there's a new Homes Ombudsman scheme. So what? And we're nearly there, and I think we're going to have a few minutes of questions. How will building professionals need to respond? Well, first of all, anybody in the sector needs to get real. The Building Safety Act is for all. It's not an optional extra. It's not just for high-rise apartments. It's for everything. And there are going to be some very explicit new requirements around competence. And everybody working in the industry needs to be thinking, how can I demonstrate that I am competent to do what I do? What evidence would I put in front of somebody who asked me to demonstrate my competence? And that needn't be a regulator, that could be a client taking their new responsibility to take all reasonable steps to assure themselves that the people they're appointing are competent. So that's going to be a big change. And then, you know, a final question about how we react to this. We do need to be clear that these changes in legislation are coming. They're not optional. They're not going away. There are going to be changes to professional accreditation for those who are in the professions. There are going to be the new roles of principal designer and contractor. The HSE will be overseeing building regulations and the building control function. There are going to be responsibilities on accountable persons in higher risk buildings. We're going to see a requirement for the golden thread, for safety cases. And for existing HRBs, there will be periodic reapproval and certification. So there is a huge amount coming. I quite understand when people ask about resources and timing, but the truth of the matter is we've had 5 years warning that major change is coming. And the best time to have started preparing would probably have been a little while ago, but if we haven't, then the time to start preparing is now. And at that, I'm going to stop and hand back to Ant, and that just leaves us 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Hal. You're a consummate pro, and thank goodness that you took your personal computer with you to Excel today. So thank you for booting that up too, so we could get you started again. If you're able to turn your camera on, Hal, we can try. There you are. Always great to see you. Again, many apologies to attendees today. These things can happen, but maybe next year I think we might do a face-to-face going forward, but we'll see how we go. So thank you for your patience. Hal, we do have a couple of questions, well, more than a few actually. You won't be surprised. You touched on an awful lot there, very broad in terms of the state of the nation. But just to pick up on a few of the headline sort of questions coming through, is you raised the issue of ventilation and it being in effect a life safety matter, and you touched upon what was a fairly new edition of approved document F. If ventilation is already covered by the building regulations, and yet we saw the tragic case of Awab Ishaq, the 2-year-old in Rochdale, what do we need to do now?
Well, one could say a lot. I think there are 3 things. People actually need to stop and ask, am I complying with Part F now? Because I cannot believe that that flat is an isolated instance.
Right.
You know, there are a lot of stories flying around about replacement windows and trickle vents. If replacement windows are helping to make homes more energy efficient because they reduce heat loss and they're more, you know, they have better U values, then if they're reducing heat loss, I think that must mean that they're probably making the home more airtight. So if you put new windows in, I don't see how you can justify not putting trickle vents in by saying, oh, it's non-worsening, the ones we took out didn't have trickle vents. What's the point of having the replacement windows if you haven't made the thing more thermally efficient? So I think we have to get real about trickle vents. And people need to be stopping and asking when they do improvement works, what about the ventilation? It's not, you know, there is a balance. We need thermal performance, we need ventilation. And I just think we need much more thinking about it. I also think we need to recognise that people who are living in poorly ventilated and probably poorly insulated homes do need more heat and more ventilation. And if they're living in social housing, it's not a building regs issue, it's a very blunt cost of living issue. And you know, government faces a challenge. How do we look after those who cannot afford to heat and ventilate their homes to be healthy? That's not a building regs issue, that's a wider social issue.
Yeah, thank you, Hal. A very full reply there. You lead into my next question that's come up. You've touched upon there the fact that the UK is in the midst of a cost of living crisis, and yet fuel bills are also no longer affordable for many households. So what should we be really doing with our 27 million existing homes? Is it time to regulate and to support and finance more?
I think there is going to be a lot of debate about regulation, and bluntly, if we've got 27 million buildings to refurbish by 2050, that's pretty well a million a year.
Yeah.
We need a plan. I don't think we've got a
plan.
No. I don't think anybody's got a clue how this is going to happen. So the first thing is we need a plan, and there is no doubt that there will be significant costs, and this has got to be done fairly. And I think you must recognise that, whatever, I don't want to be political about this, we need to think about how those least able to afford to come on this journey are going to be supported, and where, I mean, we talk about government funding, at the end of the day, it's taxpayer funding. So how is this going to be done? And again, there is a broad political conversation to be had, but it does need to be heavily informed by science and technology and engineering, so that we do sensible things. Yeah, and above all, we need a plan.
Thank you, Hal. Look, I could ask you many more questions that I have before me, but I'm mindful of the time. Thank you for being, as I say once again, a consummate pro for dealing with the technicalities of changing laptops halfway through. Thank you as always. I wish you well for the Build to Perform event in Excel, and I think you're going off for another speaking engagement this afternoon too. So thank you as always, Hal. Always good to see you. Take care.
Thanks very much, and once again, my apologies.
No, not at all. Right, moving on. A number of items that Hal actually touched upon are very pertinent to our next speaker today. It's great that Andrew Moore is able to join us once again. He kindly spoke at last year's summit to tell us where the HSE and the Building Safety Regulator have gotten to on its journey. Just as a way of a reminder, Andrew has over 20 years experience within the Health and Safety Executive. In this time, he's worked on the front line to improve health and safety standards in agriculture, public services, manufacturing, waste and recycling, and not least construction. More recently, Andrew is the industry competence lead within the HSE Building Safety Regulator team, and this involves him liaising with industry stakeholders to support new standards, guidance, and frameworks. Andrew, it's great to have you back. Welcome. Over to you, sir.
Hi there. Thank you, Anthony. Hi there, everyone. Yeah, really nice to be back. Hopefully I can build on some of the things that I mentioned last year and very much build on some of the messages that Hal was talking about in his presentation. So yes, as I said, my name's Andrew Moore. Excuse me. I've been in the Health and Safety Executive now for 20 years. As has been explained, mainly in a frontline regulatory role, but now my focus is very much on industry competence. And as the speaker before me, I think I'll speak for about 35 minutes-ish, but hopefully leave plenty of times for questions. So as I've spoken at a BSI conference previously, and I think as Hal set out some of the background very well, I won't go over that. I think as you'll hopefully all be aware, obviously following the Grenfell tragedy, Dame Judith Hackett had an independent review, and one of her key recommendations was the establishment of the Building Safety Regulator and HSE, and a new regime, as been so eloquently described by Hal, which will hopefully build people's confidence in the building safety system. As was mentioned previously, and I'm going to kind of double down on this message a few times within this presentation, the new regulatory regime isn't just about high-rise buildings. High-rise buildings are a very important element, but they're just one of three key focuses. So I'm going to start with the oversight function first, and as was mentioned previously, oversight has really sort of two key elements to it. The first element is the regulation of the building control profession, creating a regulated profession, and the next is the wider oversight of the built environment, ensuring safety and standards for buildings now and in the future. So just picking up on the building control side a little bit, BSR is developing performance standards called operational standards rules and key performance indicators to really oversee, monitor and assess the performance of the profession. And this all comes from the key driver highlighted by Dame Judith in her report around increasing consistency and moving the profession away from what she perceived and what was perceived within the report as a service provider role into a more regulatory space. I don't, and we don't within the BSR see this as any sort of criticism of very diligent building control professionals, just a recognition that there's been some inconsistency in past and looking at ways to try and address that. So the wider oversight of the built environment obviously builds on that building control profession, but extends it to the whole, all buildings. Really looking to assess holistically as possible the safety and standards for buildings. Again, just to kind of triple down or quadruple down on the message, not just high-rise buildings or higher risk buildings. The two key interventions are probably worth noting with regards to BSR's activity are it taking on the lead for technical policy and the approved documents from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, DLUC. We will be taking on that role. DLUC will retain the policy lead for the building regulations and the Act, but actually the technical policy, the approved documents, the guidance that sits underneath that, HSE will be, in the form of the BSR, will be taking that lead. And what we will look to do is really assess how that whole system is working, challenge where it's not being used effectively, and change where we think actually, you know what, the standards are maybe not working, need updating, need to consider future needs. So as part of that process, this the next slide is the Building Advisory Committee. And this sort of dovetails in and supports nicely that wider oversight, as we'll be using this to think about the strategic steps we need to take to improve standards. So it'll be made up of 13 leaders and experts across the spectrum of industry. The recruitment process has just finished, and we aim to have a first meeting in December. I think it's obviously Hal, who spoke previously, was the chair of the Building Regulation Advisory Committee. BAC isn't going to replace BRAC in its functions. It will have, from our perspective, a wider remit, a much more strategic overview, we hope, to encourage and promote the use of the right standards, and as I say, challenge where necessary, think about those new and emerging issues, but also provide intelligence, think about the effectiveness of the regime as it is, and including the proportionality, let's be honest, of the BSR's approach. So the slide there shows all the different activities and roles that BAC will be performing. The strategic group will obviously, the steering group will operate at a strategic level. We'll have technical committees underneath. And BAC will very much be an advisory committee for the BSR. So lots of the action I've described may not be taken directly by the committee itself. It may be fed back into the BSR for it to take action, and this sort of the evidence base for that to happen. So moving into competence, my area, and I'll say it again. The BSR has responsibility to promote competence across all buildings. And I think, as I said last year, double down again on this point. Lots of feedback I've had from various stakeholders, and I think Hal touched on this as well in his presentation, that people will look to avoid the new regulatory regime by not working on higher rise residential buildings. And I think it's important to say that's just simply not the case. The oversight and the competence requirements and the law, which I'll touch upon later on, extend much wider and much more widely than just high-rise buildings. And the approach, we've taken to competence very much follows the recommendation of Dame Judith Hackett, looking to support industry to come up with frameworks and standards for training and verification. We really don't see as government's job to set all this out, because we acknowledge the people who's doing the job in industry are best placed to understand what needs to happen to raise the game. I think, again, part of the process, and I was privileged to be on the steering committee for the various PASs that Al mentioned previously, is actually trying to work out what is proportional. Actually acknowledge we want to be aspirational in terms of the competency requirements, but we don't want to set the barrier so high that it can't be reasonably achieved. So actually trying to work through all of that and work out what the requirements are and how these can be achieved is possibly one of the challenges. As it says there, we've recruited an independent industry competence committee to really help us with this activity. At the moment, we have an interim industry competence committee who have a really pivotal role in advising the industry and BSR on competence. In essence, it mirrors back in terms of industry representatives, but purely focused on competence. And so we see it as providing that link between industry and BSR, that link in the middle, to guide on what the priority areas are and what action needs to be taken, what will the best results be. This slide is a little bit busy. Apologies for that. It also sets out lots of the activity, the monitoring, the guidance, etc. I think this slide may well be a little bit more helpful because that sets out in a much more probably a more simplistic way what the committee is looking to achieve. So obviously starts with industry, the stakeholders. I think what we want to start doing is to review, monitor and what's actually going on in terms of competence provision, where are the gaps, where are the challenges, who's doing it well, then oversee this to try and think about how we facilitate improvements, and that might be through advice to the BSR, or it might be through direct advice to industry or potentially the public. Then kind of completing the circle, we want to carry out research to learn, to really understand, is what we're doing effective, what more can we do, and obviously complete the cycle again. So that's the plan of what we want to do. How we want to do it is sort of set out in this slide, and this is a theory of change model for competence, or intervention logic model, and it sort of sets out the process at a very high level that we think needs to occur in order to improve competence. Improve competence is obviously a very big thing to say, so this unpacks that to a certain extent and puts that into a stage process. So going from left to right, what we need to have first is those standards, frameworks, codes, guidance. So individuals in the built environment, no matter what sector or role they're in, understand what the competence requirements are. And a lot of this work has already happened. Obviously, the BSI PAS standards for principal contractor, principal designer, and those managing buildings is exactly what's required to set out those standards, along with the Flex document, which explains how those competency frameworks can do that. And then the work of the competence steering group is also really pivotal in setting out further benchmarks, further requirements for different trades, professions and crafts across the built environment. Some of the work of the interim industry competence committee, we look to survey the wider built environment. I mentioned CSG, I mentioned the BSI, but actually there's lots and lots of sectors out there, and we're not sure who has frameworks and guidance to set out competence and who doesn't. So I think that's part of the work the interim committee will be doing. The next box is thinking about training. So once we've set out all of that, all of those standards, what people need to do, we need to have a way, the infrastructure for them to upskill, to validate, to demonstrate competence, essentially turning the aspirations into reality. One of the key things that we're looking to do here, the interim competence committee, is actually looking to identify those bodies, trade association, professional bodies who we feel should be stepping up and providing training here, and actually ask them what they're doing, essentially, and ask them about a timetable to provide some of this training, some of this work to support their members and others reach the requirements. The next element is the employer worker response, possibly the hardest. So once you've built it, making sure they come. So thinking about how do we influence organizations to make use of frameworks and to use the infrastructure that's in place, take up the training, the upskilling. So it's the role for the ICC and the BSR to promote the good work that's going on, but also look at some of those strategic barriers and influences to take it further. So for example, funding is quite often a barrier to training. So thinking about how we can encourage organizations to access funding that's available, how we can publicize that, how we can look at ways around that. So as an example, that's the sorts of things that we'll be looking to achieve. And then looking at some of those medium-term outcomes in terms of hopefully behavior change and the long-term impacts, hopefully in terms of safer buildings. As Hal mentioned, obviously this is underpinned by a regulatory framework. It was called the Appointment of Persons, Industry Competence and Duty Holders Regulations, quite a mouthful. My understanding is that now these requirements are going to be just put straight into the building regulations rather than having a specific piece of secondary legislation. Either way, the requirements will be there. And those of you that are familiar with health and safety law at all, health and safety law for construction, it's called construction design and management, and essentially all of the processes from that have been mirrored within the building regulations. And there's a recognition that the CDM regs have had a positive impact on construction health and safety culture, and looking to have essentially identical positive impacts within the building regulation culture. So they're the same roles, client, principal contractor, principal designer, and similar requirements in terms of coordinating, cooperating, plan, manage and monitor compliance this type with the building regs rather than health and safety. Just spending a little bit of time on this, I think it's important to note clients have a duty within the law now. They set the tone and emphasis for any project, and it's really important that they have duties and are aware that they have duties. Principal designers, a really key role within the new regulatory regime. I think one of the key elements important. The principal designer is part of the design team, not a third party without any influence. And I know that sounds very obvious. However, within the health and safety landscape, we often find the principal designer role is contracted out to a health and safety consultant who has limited authority and influence over design. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen here. We want the principal designer to be someone who leads the design team and coordinates the design team, because ultimately the whole point of the role is to ensure there are no gaps, no siloed working, and that the project can assessed holistically with somebody, i.e. the PD, who has ultimate responsibility to do this. I think it's important to say, I know there's a certain amount of trepidation, that the principal designer is not expected to be an expert in every design specialism. They need to know enough about the building regulations to assess whether or not a building complies or not. So, for example, it's quite legitimate, the principal designer, if they're an architect, for example, that they challenge other designers who are structural engineers, for example, to prove to them that the building regulations, that they comply to building regulations. It's that coordination, that challenge role, that's the sort of the key defining feature and requirement of the principal designer. And then finally, principal contractors, they should take responsibility for the site, be a conduit to at least manage the flow of information, really get the right information to the right people to do the right thing at the right time. And they obviously can't perform that role in isolation. I think for me, from the health and safety sphere, quite often the thing that's missing is monitoring. Quite often paperwork is taken at face value, and actually there isn't the checks and balances to making sure that what happens on paper is happening in reality. And I think my thing and the BSR's message will be that the principal contractor can't do their job sitting in a site hut or in an office far away from the project. There actually needs to have monitoring on site to make sure that this is what's happening. And just to reiterate, the PAS work, the work for BSI, principal designer and principal contractors should really help and add some clarity and some real detail around these roles. And just to double down again, this is for all buildings. Every project other than a very small self-build will require a principal designer and principal contractor to manage compliance with the building regs. Yeah, every project. So I'm over halfway through, and I'm just touching on high-rise buildings now, and which I think gives a bit of a flavour that the BSR is doing lots of work and looking at lots of areas that go beyond high-rise buildings. But obviously, high-rise buildings and the regulatory regime is a very, very important and fundamental part of what we will be doing. Again, how very helpfully defined high-rise buildings. I think rather than going through all of the detail in this slide, which sets out the design and construction process, I just want to talk about the emphasis that the BSR will be taking, and the emphasis will be very much on a strict requirement for design to include safety measures before moving on to build. And I think this has come from experience, typified in Grenfell, that safety requirements, fire requirements aren't included in initial plans. They're sort of retrofitted on in a less optimal means to try and just about comply with the regulations later on. The new regulations will essentially put a stop to that. If the design isn't right and includes a proper safety precautions, fire precautions, you're not moving to the next stage. And we think this is probably going to be a big change in the industry, because it won't be acceptable for design to be an iterative process going back and forth between the client and contractor. There'll be a very strict change control that may require resubmission to the BSR as a regulator if there are significant changes. So as a regulator, the BSR won't be asking, well, can you demonstrate it complies with the building regs, because that will have already happened at the design stage. The BSR will be saying, have you built that to your design? And if you have deviated from design and can't evidence those deviations through the agreed change control procedures, that might lead to problems, and that might lead to quite considerable problems. So I think it will be for some projects, I think this will be quite a significant culture shift in the way that work occurs, and the expectations around design and around design being fixed. Yes, so the golden thread. I think this is really important. I think the BRAC definition is a very good one. I personally use an even shorter definition. It's the important information about building safely. And your test of something that goes into the golden thread is it important for building safety? Is it something that somebody trying to manage a building now or in the future would need to know? If yes, you keep it. If no, you don't. I know that sounds easy and probably a massive oversimplification, because I think a lot of the information you'll get is probably going to be in that grey area in the middle. But that requires somebody or a team of people to make some intelligent decisions about what information they keep. Obviously, you will require some software, some IT infrastructure to store the information, collate it. However, I don't think there's going to be software that will enable you to do those very difficult decisions. I don't know if there's an Elon Musk style Cyberdyne Systems, Skynet, AI supercomputer out there. I think that requires people to make those difficult decisions, because, and I may have said this last year, I think the worst decision that you could make is to keep everything, because if you mix the unimportant with the important, you make the important unobtainable, in my experience. And I mentioned this last year, and I sort of mentioned this whenever I speak on the golden thread. There's a great episode with on Yes Minister, excuse me, where Sir Humphrey explains to the minister the best way to hide an incriminating document is to file it, as it's a surefire guarantee nobody will ever find it again, which is not what we want to happen. brilliant, new slide. So mandatory occurrence reporting. Not going to speak about this in too much detail. We'll look for responsible people to capture reports of fire and structural issues, or the precursors to fire and structural issues. During the design and construction phase, this will be the principal designer and principal contractor. During occupation, this will be the principal accountable person or the accountable people, accountable persons. I don't have lots of details to give on this, but just to say that there will be almost certainly looking at those kind of key indicators of any potential catastrophic failure. Safety cases. So moving away from the design and construction into an occupation, one of the key requirements, as I'm sure lots of you are aware, will be the production of a safety case and a safety case report for those managing high-rise buildings. It's a very new concept, safety case of high-rise buildings in occupation. It comes from the regulation of chemicals, nuclear, aviation as a way to mitigate the types of high hazard events that happen in those sectors. And to think about a safety case, it's almost to think about it like a risk assessment to a certain extent, thinking about identify those hazards, the route that people are likely to be harmed, how it will happen, and the measures that are in place to reduce these risks or limit or mitigate the consequences. So the safety case is very much all the information that's drawn from your golden thread that you're using to manage the risk of fire and structural safety in your building. It's the evidence essentially used to demonstrate or justify how you're preventing a major accident in your building. The safety case report then, it's almost like a triangle to a certain extent. Sort of the golden threads at the bottom, safety case is the next level, and the safety case report sits at the top, and it summarizes your safety case and essentially sets out how you're managing it. And it really needs to be a meaningful document, non-technical, that anyone can pick up and understand, that could be given to a contractor or similar, who have a pretty good idea what's going on in your building. And proportionality here is the key. It needs to be meaningful, but not overly dense and technical. And in my experience, I've seen lots of organisations that go the wrong way in two ways. Either pay lip service to it, throw a couple of documents and think it might be okay, or they take a totally risk-averse approach and throw the kitchen sink at it, and it becomes unintelligible. Again, unfortunately, both those strategies are wrong. It's really about trying to tell that story in a proportionate way. My advice to anyone would be to go to the BSR website, and there's lots and lots of information there, a step-by-step approach of all the factors you want to consider when creating a safety case and a safety case report. I haven't put the link in here, but if you just put BSR safety case into Google or any other search engine, I haven't used another search engine in a long time, but any others will do, I'm sure, it will all come up. And it gives some step-by-step pointers of how to construct and how to construct the safety case and how to write the report. One of the things that we've been asked for in the past is to produce a template. We don't think this is appropriate for a number of reasons. One, we don't think there's a template which is right for all eventualities. And also, we worry a template moves us into that tick box realm that we want to avoid. Developing the safety case and the safety case report isn't just about the paperwork of the end document. It's about demonstrating you've been through that holistic process, thought about the hazards, properly control them. The paperwork is just the evidence at the end you've done this. It's not the whole process and story. Actually doing the work is the important bit. The paperwork just demonstrates it's there. So we worry that producing a template will lend to avoiding actually doing the safety case management and just concentrating on the paper side at the end, which is really not what what it's looking to achieve. Final slide here, or second, almost final. Enforcement. BSR will have lots of enforcement powers to stop things, special measures for those not carrying out their duties, etc. I'm not going to go into the actual powers themselves, but I just wanted to reflect upon the HSE's approach to enforcement, as I'm pretty sure that the BSR will adopt either the same or a very similar approach. First thing to say, that HSE sees enforcement as a positive act to reduce risk and to prevent danger. We're certainly not gung-ho about enforcement, but when it's consistent, proportionate and targeted, we see enforcement as a very important tool to ensure compliance. We don't see enforcement always as a last resort when other methods of persuasion have failed. If the risk compliance determines that enforcement is the right action, we will take it as the first course of action if we think that is the right step that needs to take. I mean, as health and safety law, and to a certain extent there is interpretation within the building regs, we use lots of different sources of guidance to establish a benchmark to enforce against. And there's frequently asked, and I think there's probably a misunderstanding that the HSE would only enforce against standards that have been either published by government or approved by government in some way. Certainly with the HSE at the moment, we would use industry consensus standards, codes of practice, etc., to base enforcement action against. We term these established standards. So even if we haven't developed it, we will still use that to base enforcement action on. I just wanted to kind of draw that out, because certainly within the competence sphere, the work that's been done to create standards, etc., within a competence steering group, etc., these won't be approved by government. We are actively encouraging industry to create them. However, we will use them as government to say, well, actually, that's your benchmark. That's what you should be achieving, and that's what we will enforce against. And I don't think this is being gung-ho about enforcement. I don't want to scare everyone that we're going to go enforcement crazy, but it's just to set out that HSE sees enforcement as a really appropriate action that needs to be taken, and considers it very widely across industry. And it's just really essentially to reflect on the way that the HSE is operating at the moment, because I imagine that will translate, if not directly, in some shape or form, into the way that we operate within the Building Safety Regulator. And just finally, multidisciplinary teams. So as well as talking about all the stuff sort of linking on from regulator, this is how we're going to operate in terms of the regulators. So one of the criticisms of the Grenfell tragedy, regulators not operating in joined up capacity. So we decided very early on that we weren't going to try and recreate specialisms within the Building Safety Regulator, because actually we've got the expertise in others, building control, fire authority. So what we're going to do is all work together and form what's called a multidisciplinary team to assess the parts of the project that are within our competence, skill set, expertise. HSE, the BSR, will be the ultimate decision maker within that process, but actually we'll make those decisions based on the recommendations of building control experts and fire experts. And that is me. So I'm quite happy to take some questions, and I'll put on my camera.
Andrew, absolutely fantastic. Thank you once again for joining us. That was really insightful, and you've got quite a few questions coming through. So if you're able to turn your camera on so we can see you, that would be great. And we'll take a couple of questions if we may. There you are. So, how are you doing? All right. Right. So thank you for labouring the point. Some of us that do quite a bit of speaking engagements about the Building Safety Act and the new regime, we do go out of our way to talk about, it will affect, if not all, but most buildings in England and building work. And so thank you for that point. But we've had a question from Stephen, and I'm guessing he works within the subsector. He asked, does the Building Safety Act apply to buildings owned by infrastructure managers, such as Network Rail or Highways England, e.g. station buildings and depots?
So the requirements for the building, and again, it's I have to go and check the exact definition of building within the Act, and possibly I'll come back to this because yeah, it would depend on whether or not those infrastructure elements are classified as a building within the Act. I don't have the Act in front of me.
No.
I don't have a total recall of the Act, so it's something I can go away and check. But I think the answer is it's whether or not those elements are defined as a building, quote unquote, within the Act. And I think there's some quite clear definitions of what a building is, because I know certainly for the high-rise element, there is questions about when buildings are connected. Is that one building or two buildings, etc., etc. And those discussions are happening at the moment. But I can take that away and come back quite with something a bit definitive.
If you could, that would be great. I mean, I didn't have the opportunity to draw up the Act. Being mindful that the Act overlays and changes the 84 Building Act, that will still have exemptions. So there'll be probably certain exemptions from recollection for crown buildings and similar. So if we could do that, that would be great. But Stephen, you know, the application typically would apply to what looks and feels like a building. So maybe retail on a Network Rail site, maybe yes, but definitive supporting ancillary buildings for the rail network, probably not. But if we could check that, Andrew, that would be great. So thank you ever so much. Question in from Stuart. Very grateful for taking us through the competency piece, hugely important competency piece. Just wondering though, will professional qualifications alone be sufficient to show your competency in the future?
I think they'll be part of that story. So, for example, if I think about the work that's been carried out with the competence steering group, where different trade associations have come together to think about what is the requirement for a particular industry, professional qualifications are part of that story, but you may require additional extra bits. So, for example, to be a principal designer, for example, you would need to, as well as a professional qualification, be able to demonstrate knowledge of the building regulations, and also be able to demonstrate knowledge around and skills around being able to manage and coordinate. So there will be additional extras depending on the roles that you take, and you might find that actually some of the competency frameworks will set out tiers. So, for example, to carry out a certain role in a non-high risk building would require certain elements, but actually additional, that maybe beyond professional qualifications and additional upskilling might be required to take on those jobs within higher risk buildings. So yes, it will be part of the story, but it won't just be the whole story. And I think when talk to your trade associations, because the majority of trade associations are hopefully plugged into the work of the CSG and the different work they're doing to develop competency frameworks within different sectors and subsectors around industry. I hope that sort of helps.
No, absolutely, more than. Thank you, Andrew. Another one here from Peter. Great to hear that the undertaking of supporting research will form part of the work the HSE and the BSI undertakes. If the building industry is not directly involved in the back or the working groups you touched upon, will they be able to influence and input to the future research needs going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the roles of the Building Advisory Committee and the Industry Competence Committee will actually be to engage with industry in a wider sense to work out what those needs are and what the research needs are for industry. I mean, I think obviously one of the most obvious uses of research will be to evaluate, will be to say we've done something, or activity has happened here. Has it been effective? And can we prove it's been effective? If it hasn't been effective, why hasn't it been effective? And what more can we do? So a lot of what we'll be doing is to try to evaluate that. But yeah, I think actually listening to what the needs are in terms of research, I think is a really crucial part of the way that those committees are operating, because I think what we see is both of those committees to be a funnel into HSE, to a way to get the litmus test of what industry is doing and understand that and bringing that in so that the BSR can prioritise based on all that insight. So yeah, I think the answer is yes.
Brilliant, thank you. Good question, good answer. That's great. In the short time we've got available, Andrew, if I may, you've definitely piqued interest with raising the whole issue of enforcement and the importance of ensuring enforcement. You touched upon the tools that you would utilise to assist you in enforcement, and you mentioned here in your presentation that you would use all relevant content guidance, typically such things that are consensus driven. Just, I think, for the sake of clarity, we've got a couple, two at least, just to understand that. Does that mean, in terms of achieving enforcement because you haven't achieved compliance, could you be calling upon and utilising documents that aren't even cited in the approved documents themselves, if they are the right documents that one would expect a competent designer builder to follow?
Yes.
Wow.
I think is the short answer to that, because, for example, in the competence sphere, all of the frameworks, for example, will not be cited in the approved documents. And all of those will become the basis for which we will say, this is the standard that you need to meet as a fire risk assessor, for example. That won't be cited in the approved documents, but that will become the expectation. So I think the answer is a big yes. And I think this is a message I really want to push out, because I think there's a fear, certainly from, if you think from flipping it the other way around, there's a fear from the competence side that the BSR won't be able to use what is being produced if it isn't linked in some shape or form into that statutory framework. And I think that the clear message is that we will be able to use it. We'll call it an established standard, and that's the way we describe it at the moment, and we will use it to link enforcement. So usually when we answer questions, I'm a bit more caveated with things, but I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, that's great, and that's a hugely important point to finish on. We find it quite interesting at BSI that quite often BS standards are cited in court cases where there might not be any legislation in place, but the only place they can find out what good looks like was a voluntary British standard, and that's why it gets used in all. Yeah, so again, I think, Andrew, thank you for that. Thank you for your presentation today. I think that's truly insightful, and we'll have you get back again, please, sir, because as we now wrap into the formation and the operation of the Building Safety Regulator, I think, and I believe that the industry will benefit from more insight from yourselves and setting out as clearly as you have done thus far as to the direction of travel. So thank you once again for joining us, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care, Andrew. Thank you. It's now time for a short break, if we may. I suggest we just take a comfort break till 10:40. Go and grab a coffee. That's what I certainly will be doing. And then we'll come back and, as I say, recommence at 10:40. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everybody. I hope you managed to grab a comfort break or at least look at your emails. Next up, we've got Mike Wood, who's very kindly come to join us to talk about the testing and certification of construction products. I know Mike a very long time. By background and as a way of introduction, Mike is a glass process and product technologist, and he started with Pilks back in 1974. And it claims here before me in his bio that he retired in 2012, but we know that is not true. His career first included R&D, followed by safety, product, market, and strategic business development. He's been a member of a number of BSI fire-related committees for many years, for which I'm very grateful. Recent highlights have been his involvements in the development and review of our fire safety engineering standards, 9999, 9991, and also, of course, the fire door assembly standard, BSA 214. Mike is a passionate campaigner for fire safety and has had a long-standing personal commitment to fire safety. He has a long-time association and connection with the Architectural and Specialist Door Manufacturers Association, with a focus on specialist and bespoke fire doors. But he's also has an expert interest in other standards more generally. Other association involvements have included him chairing the Fire Safety Development Group, the Passive Fire Protection Federation, and the Fire Resistant Glazing Group of the Glass and Glazing Federation. And he was a founding member of the Fire Sector Federation itself. Mike is also currently technical advisor on a voluntary basis to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fire Safety. Mike, we're glad you haven't retired, and we're really glad to have you today. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Ant. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me, and I hope it stays like that. This is going to be very much a personal perspective, and you've heard my background. My particular experience does come from consideration of the use of glass in buildings and glass in architectural design. I've had a long association with specialist and bespoke fire doors as well, and I'm a technical advisor to ASMA, not ASDA, but ASMA, the Architectural and Specialist Door Manufacturers Association. And the only thing I would add to Ant's introduction is that along the way with Pilkington, I was responsible for testing refractories for use in glass making furnaces, which proved quite useful later, but I didn't know at the time. And I had a very useful time living and working in Germany for several years. And if I'm going to be honest, as I am, that's had an influence on my thinking with regard to how to develop products and how to see products in fire safety. The Germans are far more rigorous than we are, I think. And rather than products, they would refer to product system engineering, and that's more or less where I am. So this is a personal view, very much so. In the words of the 60s hit by the Animals, I'm sorry, that's my teenage years. I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Please don't let me be misunderstood. So with that, I'm not going to dwell on this. I think we all know we face a critical moment in time for fire safety, and a lot's happening. The Grenfell catastrophe, certainly profoundly shocking, profound shake-up. It shouldn't have happened, and we should leave it for the inquiry to finish its job with its report. As the judge summed up, that there's a task there to untangle individual mistakes from commercial company cultures and company mistakes, common misconceptions, and the common paradigm that applied in building design at the time when the design was put together. So we wait for the inquiry. The Hackett report has been referred to, 156 pages and thousands of words, which so often you hear summarized in four words: the system is broken. I don't entirely buy that in its entirety. Certainly the system has not worked as it should have done, and it needs to be repaired, and we've heard a certain amount of work a lot of work going on to do that, so we should let that run its course. Part of that is new foundation legislation, which very much is establishing a competency-based culture, and competency for me implies knowledge base as well as the right attitude. And I think a lot of people will agree that there needs to be a tremendous improvement in the level of knowledge. And as far as I'm concerned, that applies very much to products. And that's the expectation I have with the Morel report, Testing for a Safer Future, which was set up by government to report last year, about a year ago, which I believe it did, on testing and certification aspects. We haven't seen it yet, and it isn't yet in the public domain, so it isn't commonly appreciated what it contains. It's been withheld, and the reason why is not clear, but as far as I'm concerned, I have high hopes of the Morel report, and I think it will be just as important as the Hackett report. I expect it to be. There's going to be plenty of food for thought, I'm sure, in its content. To sum up, there is a desperate need, really, to rebuild trust. Not just trust in how construction works, but trust in products and design. And at this point, I think I'd like to make 3 key points on the basis of trust. First of all, there hasn't so far been enough focus on the good, and there are strengths in the UK approach. There are good products, there are good companies, there are certainly good sectors and good approaches which can provide examples, but they've not been given enough airtime, and hopefully we can start that and get more attention. Number 2, it isn't right and logical to assume that problems identified in one particular area automatically translate across to problems in all areas. But that seems to be the dominant thinking, and it's a narrative that seems to suit the way forward. But I would make a plea to look at the good examples and to follow those up rather than inventing new solutions. There are existing solutions already. The third point is really the backbone of this presentation and the main plea. There needs to be a much better technical understanding and focus on products. That's their applications and how they function. What I'm going to describe, I'm at pains to point out, is not a reaction to what has happened, the disasters that I've listed above and the events that have followed from it. In addition to Grenfell, there's Lacanau House beforehand, for example, which caused, from the coroner's report, a request for a review of building regulatory guidance. Before that, there's Summerland, which was in its time was a massive catastrophe, and we're still referring back to it 50 years next year. So there's a lot to do. What I'm going to describe already exists as benchmark standards. It's not a reaction to disasters, but it's something that already exists that is available to be exploited. I'm going to look at 3 key topics. Responsibilities of product manufacturers, but not just manufacturers. It all seems to come down on the manufacturer, but there are others in the commercial chain who have equal, if not more, responsibility. There is a duty of care and a chain of custody extending from the factory gate through processing, handling, merchanting, fabrication, and especially installation, which imposes obligations on all those involved. And I'm not sure so far that those responsibilities are really fully taken on board in every case. It includes designers, as you've heard, specifiers, and those in purchasing who sometimes, in effect and inadvertently, step into the role of specifier by changing the product that's there in the specification for one that is deemed to be perhaps equivalent, without going into the technical detail of establishing whether it is equivalent or not. So there are key elements there of responsibilities along the chain. I'm going to, I would do, wouldn't I, as a product technologist, I would call for a better focus on products and the principles that govern products. Because products make buildings, and safer buildings need safe products. And that's a simple equation, along with safe design and the safe use and application of products in design. I don't think there's an excuse for not understanding products. There is plenty of safe sources of information to go to ask questions of, and I'll come on to that later. Responsible companies and their responsible trade bodies are well able to answer questions and provide explanations, and are happy to do so in most cases. So please track down those sources and just ask the questions. Then, technology is very, not just the product, but product technology is very important, and I'll describe what I mean by that, how to evaluate a technology. It means a lot of testing. At the end of the day, validation of performance, confidence in product performances and assurance of product performances is fundamentally important, and that requires testing, a lot of testing, which leads into certification. So I will finish up with an explanation of what I mean by certification, as opposed to what you may mean by certification. So the first part, responsibilities of manufacturers and others. For me, it's clear, for me at least, that anybody who produces a product and handles a product, you can't just throw it into the market and expect others to decide how to use it and to know how to use it. So fitness for purpose is key, not just compliance with the specification, but demonstrating fitness for purpose, which includes, especially for fire, safety applications. In some cases, not just fire safety, but certainly safety in various applications in other respects. For doors, for example, that would be safe use of the doors, opening, closing, no accidents, no injuries, etc., etc. Not so easy to achieve. So the manufacturers and those handling products need to understand the purpose, where the product is going, and the range of applications that apply, including the requirements in each application and the situations that arise. And it really does need a necessary risk assessment of those applications and situations, reference the building profile and the occupancy profile, the sorts of processes that apply in BS 9999 and BS 991, the principles of fire safety engineering. And with all of that requires not only where the product is going, but the conditions that apply in the use, the standards that apply, and the regulations that apply, and the regulatory guidance and the policies that apply. That's all behind understanding fitness for purpose. With reference, I think guidance on how to use and apply products is very important, not only from manufacturers, but especially from trade bodies. Within that, there are three particular points I want to draw attention to. There's a good word in fire resistance called integrity, which means technical correctness and rigor. And I don't think that can be placed on one side. That should be a primary requirement, which leads to the second point, which I think is really quite important, that technical should be above marketing. Marketing should be subordinate to technical, where we have technical applications and technical products. I'm afraid too often it's the other way around, and we don't have the technical substance, but we have the image marketing. And that's not, as far as I'm concerned, something that is desirable if we're looking at safety and safety critical in particular. You can't avoid the relevance of information and data to the situation and the use. That's in particular data and information which must be appropriate, relevant and applicable, ARA. So it isn't acceptable to take test information for one product and apply it to another or to a different design. It isn't appropriate, it isn't relevant, and it wouldn't be applicable. Those three: technical correctness, image, marketing subordinate to technical, and the relevance of information and data to the situation and use of the product, very important. I'll add that the final point, that extensive technical support and guidance is needed, and for that I really am a great believer. You heard at the beginning in the introduction and explaining my commitment to trade associations. I think they're very important. They're very important indeed, because they represent the particular sector and companies in the sector and those who serve the companies in the sector. They're ideal for bringing together best practice guidance, so to speak, on neutral ground without commercial implications, and they can bring it together from the companies in the sector and summarize it and make it available for all those who are going to be using the products provided by the sector. So the next two slides illustrate, just by reason of illustration and example, some of the documents that come from ASMA. There are others. I've just picked these because these are some of the main documents, but there's smaller ones. There's single page documents, double page documents, 5-page documents. These are just examples of some of the key documents that are available from the Trade Association's Knowledge Centre on its website, easy to find. So more than 100 pages of a best practice guide. It stood the test of time. Really is best practice from a former age maybe, but it's still the best practice of the sector. There's explanation on things like the fire safety order. Similarly, there'll be guidance on the Building Safety Act and the Fire Safety Act and so on. Recommendations on acoustics, because that's just as important for many doors as fire safety is. How to install, maintenance, damage and troubleshooting advice, safety considerations including security, and coordination of bespoke door sets with what's around it and how it fit into a building. Right, so I want to focus rather than product on product technology. The first point is really quite fundamental, that a lot of construction products fundamentally depend on a system mentality. A fire door, for example, it's surprising. You may not realize a fire door is really quite complex construction. But you find in a fire door something like 50 main items in a single door. They're available to manufacturers, something like 144 different timbers commercially available on the market. Something like, typically they'll hold in stock 70 to 80 veneers. Amazingly, that if you sketch out and draw the various configurations, single doors, double doors, single acting, double acting, with panels, with glazing, with side panels, with side glaze, etc., there's a total of 288 door configurations you can draw up. A manufacturer, not producing commodity product, but producing specialized bespoke doors to individual specifications, maybe 50, 20, 30, up to 100 or so at a time. The plant will be in different workstations, and there may be 20 to 30 workstations in line, and products will go through various workstations according to the specification that they're going to be satisfying. So the product system mentality is fundamental, and in effect that relates to the whole building.
A fire door will go into a partition or a wall. It's related to a floor. The whole built element is combined with other built elements in the whole building. So a holistic approach to fire safety is really quite important. It's a consideration of the whole, and in particular the parts. So, for example, the supplier of parts, in particular hardware suppliers, sealant suppliers, glass, certainly it applies to glass. Those manufacturers in their turn need to relate to the purpose for their products, and they need to test for the applications of those products, so they don't leave all the testing to the door manufacturer. There's testing at different levels, not only the finished door, but also the component level indoors. So there's a multiplication of testing effort, and I really do want to emphasize that. Components can't be looked at in isolation. A hinge doesn't make a fire door. A hinge is part of a fire door system and has to be tested in a fire door system. Glass needs to be tested in glazing systems, which are the frames, the seals, the retaining beads and fixings, and so on. All designed for the use. So the technology is really quite fundamental, a technology approach, not just a product approach. And the technology needs to be robust. And by that I mean that it isn't sensitive to particular conditions. It's able to cope with a lot of different conditions that you might not be able to anticipate way in advance. So a low probability of failure. Awareness of limits, product capability, and the range, all established through testing, and keep testing. So the testing should never finish. And all the time you're looking through the testing to develop and expand the scope of design and the range of application. So rather than testing just one particular aspect, you're continuing to explore different combinations, different designs, different situations involving, for glass, for example, larger and larger sizes. It's not testing on one spot, but testing within a field of application and developing the boundary of that application. The key conclusion is you can't leave fire safety to chance, or any safety for that matter. It must be something that's designed for, planned for, focused on, and continually evaluated against the conditions where the product is going to be used, potentially and actually. That's a very important point. Fire safety must be designed for, and it must be focused on specifically to perform in the conditions where it's expected to behave safely and as intended. It must follow a scientific approach. Actually, developers of products follow a scientific approach, probably without realizing it. And there's got to be a role for a technical product technologist. I sometimes wonder if I'm the only one who thinks that. So many times I just see products looked at in isolation, away from the application, away from the technology, just as a product in isolation. So it's important to have, you could call it theory, but it's more than that, a product technology model. So you put all the sum total of testing information together that you're aware of, and sometimes you'll be testing to evaluate a weakness, to see if it is a weakness. Sometimes you'll be testing beyond the field of known test experience just to evaluate where that takes you. So it's a scientific process based on a model or a theory of how, for example, a fire door works, how it functions in practice, how a glass works, how it behaves in different combinations, different sizes, different glazing arrays, including sensitivities, with a commitment to improve. So you're all the time testing the model, evaluating the theory to make sure it works, and grafting in the new information that you get from testing. So it's a continuous improvement, not static. And it's never ending, because the demands from buildings change. specifiers are notorious for asking for almost impossible requirements. So there's always pressure to develop to suit the application and the specification that's required. And so everything goes together. It's a circle. Test and refine the model, do more testing, make more observations, carry out more logical analysis of what happens, and develop very much a system understanding. The task for the technologists, the manufacturers, the developers is to communicate that understanding of how systems work, especially being honest and open on the limits of the technology, because there will be limits. So where can the product be used and where can't it be used? Where are the reservations? That sort of information should be part of the dialogue. What to look for in a test? So often I hear we got 31 minutes, we got 61 minutes, we got 62 minutes, that's enough. It isn't. It isn't. It's not just the result, you go further. So I would always take a test for fire resistance, for example, as far as it goes until I start to see failure in the test, because that's where you get most of the information. And there's a well-established technique which originally came from the military, in the American military in the 1940s, which in effect is a basic risk assessment of products and product technologies from test observations and analysis of those, and is called FMEA, failure mode and effects analysis methodology. You can put a C in there as well if you wish. FMECA, failure mode and effects and criticality analysis. Which looks at several different aspects, all of which, if you're observing a test, this is the sort of thing you should be looking for. The mode of deterioration, the onset of critical failure, and what the failure within the test actually is. There's a world of difference. For example, a mode of failure which is sudden, catastrophic, and destroys a lot of the sample, compared to gradual and progressive failure, which allows you to have a level of predictability and control. Catastrophic failure doesn't. Gradual, progressive failure does allow you to have some control. So you analyze the type of failure and the mechanism of failure and identify the root causes, which could be many, and it could be different. So many times you'll do a test and come across something which is different. Even after hundreds of tests, you'll find something which is a surprise. So identification of root cause is really quite fundamental, because that leads you to what is likely to happen in real fires. There's quite often a misconception that a fire resistance test, for example, simulates performance in a real fire. It doesn't. It's a standardized way at looking at performance under some typical fire conditions. In a fire resistance test, it's said to be a post flashover fire. But if you look at the fire temperature profile that's used, it isn't actually a peak, it's a gradual increase in heat and then maintenance of that heat. So it's a method of comparing samples and establishing some basic criteria. But if you're going to project from a test to what happens in real situations, in real fires, then you need the failure analysis, the mechanism of failure, and the identification of root causes and the mode of deterioration to give you an indication of what's going to happen in real fires, and that's going to lead you to an evaluation of the margin of safety. And if you're a product developer, a product technologist with the reputation of your company, your product, and your own reputation at stake, perhaps, then evaluation of the margin of safety is really quite fundamental, because you want to be on the safe side of the margin and not on the vulnerable side of the margin. And then you lead to product improvements and refinements, all of which is towards reducing the risk of failure in use. And if you put your name to a product, you need to have peace of mind that you've done all that you can possibly do. So you would repeat this several times. You wouldn't do just one test.
You don't just leave it at one test of one design. I borrowed this diagram from Stephen Hawking because from his book A Brief History of Time, because it saves me doing when time is of the essence a lot of fancy design work, but it captures what I'm talking about, or trying to talk about anyway. So the test, it may be just one test, but all the tests that have gone before inform that one test and lead you to that one test. And in turn, that one test goes forward and it informs all the future tests as well. So it's not a test in isolation. It's not just one result. It's a whole mix of past experience and analysis of that experience in terms of the technology and the capabilities of the technology. So if you imagine that there's lots of those situations overlapping, there's lots of those codes overlapping, it all goes to mutually reinforce itself so that you've got a good model concept of the product and how the product works. And that's really quite fundamental. Accumulated test experience. And the more the merrier, the more you can see, the better. I used to have an office which was 2 minutes away from 2 very big German test furnaces. So I used to go and see a test every day, sometimes twice a day, accumulated over weeks and over years. Each test is informed by what went before and informs what comes after. And that way, we're building a level of confidence in the technology and the know-how, how that technology is used to develop products and product designs. Developers can't ever rest on their laurels. You're always moving on to the next one. I'm quite near the end now.
There are 2 slides, but this one carries quite a lot. It does a lot of work. It carries quite a lot of weight. The testing is not in isolation. It goes into third-party, what I refer to as product and process certification. There are different types of certification. You might be familiar with the lowest level, which is providing some information, some test results, maybe a test report, some basic descriptions of the product, describing the standards that apply and the application, getting a piece of paper which gives independent endorsement in effect. Might just be 1 piece of paper or 2 pieces of paper, the certificate, and then you wave that about with great joy and triumph, saying, I've got the certificate, that's all I need. It isn't really, not at all. Not if we're talking about safety critical, which requires the very top level of certification. So the process I'm talking about is the one that operates in specialist and bespoke fire doors, also in glass and in some other sectors to a degree. It's not just scrutiny of one test result, or looking at the quality control factory manual at all. It's looking at the record of testing. It includes factory audits, which means somebody going out onto the plant and actually watching the factory processes as a product progresses through the factory lines from station to station, looking at the way work is carried out against the work instructions that apply. And it's looking at the past history of testing and latest test results, and it will take samples from the production line for future testing. That might be something that was tested some years ago to test it's still the same output, and it might be one of the more complex products that goes through the line to test the capability of the production process. And it will compare audit samples with previous audit samples. If necessary, it will take samples for auditing from the marketplace, from store, from deliveries, to evaluate where there might be some concerns. And if there are concerns, then the certification will be put on hold until a base is re-established that particular issues are addressed. That's the ultimate capability. That's far higher level of scrutiny in certification than the simple one-page certificate approach. For example, the CE marking type approach, which is based on an initial type test. The purpose is not to establish fitness for use, fitness of purpose. That there's one of the technical guidance documents originally produced under the CPD, document K, that actually says that this is to demonstrate compliance with a specification, the general type specification, and not fitness for use. This process of third-party product and process certification, TPPPC, is very much evaluating safety aspects and fitness for use aspects. And it's there to establish assurance of performance, level of confidence, consistency, reliability, commitment, especially fitness for use, especially with bespoke and specialist doors, all the variations that might be needed by design requirements. And it's in particular, it's evaluation whilst the product is in the market, responding to the market. And auditing is routine. It leads to what are known as field of application reports and scope of design, which are very detailed documents. They will be something that can be several hundred pages long in some cases, typically 50, 60 pages long. I do know one of at least 300 pages long. These itemize the product, the aspects of design. So they come with material listings, specific components. They'll come with descriptions of design, descriptions of test results, reference to test reports. Drawings will be provided, and as well supporting information which can come through the trade association typically. Handling guidelines, how to store the product in a factory, for example, how to use the product, how to install the product, how to put it together. All that information is there with scope to prompt questions if you wish. It satisfies all the requirements of traceability. It gives a detailed description of the field of application of the product with scope of design and details of design. That's very, very important, an important product. That's established and working now and originated in the 80s. It's a solution developed by British industry that is available to be adapted and adopted in the service of what now is called safety critical, but it's been there for a long time. Not widely recognized, I don't think, unless you're providing doors and taking doors from a manufacturer in relevant schemes. We're getting to the end, thank goodness, you might say. So what now? There are two important things as far as I'm concerned. First of all, safety does require safety standards. We haven't started on that yet. You may be surprised to hear that. But for safety critical products in particular, that needs to be really given a focus. And we don't have those standards yet, so that work is to be done. I would like to see the second, in conjunction with that, establishing third-party product and process certification for safety critical. Safety critical, it seems to me, essentially needs to be at the highest level of certification, and that's TPPPC. We have bodies that provide that, but they're independent, commercial. They're not working at the moment to national guidelines, so we need those national guidelines. And we need a national oversight arbitration body to see that it's all working fairly, with impartiality, consistency, and with consultation of those who see themselves as part of the certification process, i.e. the manufacturers and others who take up certification, like installers, for example. Could be anybody along the chain who decides to go for third-party product and process certification. There's a way forward.
and that's going to be fundamentally part of the architecture and the environment going forward, as far as I'm concerned. And I would like that to be much more recognised and understood than it is at the moment. And I think I'll leave at that high level, Ant, and over to questions. I hope I've not left too much time for questions.
No, you haven't, but I still want to ask one, if I may. Mike, thank you ever so much. I think it's when you take us through the backdrop of products, the performance, the perceived performance, what might be their actual performance when included in works appropriately. I think it just goes to show the importance of getting it right. And, you know, something perhaps that's passed us by. So we do only have time for one question. We'll probably follow them up some more with you later, if I may, Mike. But it relates back to what we heard from Andrew, is the Building Safety Regulator from the HSE earlier. And Steve asked a question, it's a great question. We heard from the HSE earlier that they would be using consensus-based best practice guidance to enforce in the future. On that basis, rather than wait for government to do something, should industry be doing something? And if so, what should they be developing collectively in terms of construction products and what good looks like?
That sounds a bit like telepathy. I think the answer is yes. I'm a great believer industry taking control of its own area. It has to be product specific. So if you go general, I think too many loopholes. So what applies to fire doors might not apply to fire resistant glass and glazing, or insulation on the outside of buildings, or fire stopping or steelwork protection or whatever. So yes, industry should be taking control. And I think I hope I've illustrated that we are doing that in some areas. There's a lot of guidance out there. So if you've got a question, please ask, because the information is there. Honestly, it is. And you can track it down. And trade associations and companies in trade associations are committed to explaining their products. So that's one of the good features I referred to right at the beginning.
Yeah.
And we're always looking to increase the guidance. Trade associations have no regulatory authority.
No.
They work by voluntary association and committed individuals and committed companies. And we do set great store by providing as much guidance as we can in different ways. And there's new guidance. Only you may know, and only this week talking about drafting proposals for the safety product standards, starting that process going.
Yeah.
So let's not forget, when a standard goes through BSI, it comes from a lot of involvement from people from industry, volunteering, going into the committees and participating, sometimes in long meetings over quite a long time, especially if you're involved with Trouble 9-1, which has gone on for quite a time now. So yes is the answer, and we would like to prompt the regulators by doing that work.
Yeah,
to be honest, no. And we'd like to cooperate with them, and we'd like to help them.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mike. And I think that chimes perfectly, given what we heard from Andrew from HSE Building Safety Regulator earlier. But let's not wait. That chimes perfectly with Dame Judith Hackett's push that actually the industry needs to step up more and take the lead and move forward. And so I think we've got that impetus now as well. And I suppose the backdrop is, I mean, I spoke at an event yesterday with Paul Morell. He was brilliant as always, but he was very mindful that his report, whilst, as I understand it, completed, still resides with the department, with Luke, and therefore, you know, he couldn't set out what it may or may not say. And so I think let's not hang back. Let's see what we can do as an industry and move forward. And if BSI can help with that further, not just in terms of standards, then let's do it. Right.
Well,
so
we can. I'm confident in that.
Right, thank you. Mike, thank you as always. A pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for sharing your insight and understanding in a truly important area. All the best, Mike. Thank you.
I'll put the soapbox away now, Ant.
No, that's all right. Keep doing what you're doing.
Cheers.
We expect that. Right, we now move to our last session of the day, and a really important session is 2. We're looking at neurodiversity and the built environment. The presentation today is going to come from Jean Hewitt. Jean is an inclusive environment specialist with Bureau Happold and an honorary associate professor at the Bartlett, where she leads the Designing Inclusive Places module on UCL's MSc Health and Wellbeing and Sustainable Buildings programme. She currently holds a voluntary post as the UK Government's Disability and Access Ambassador for the Built Environment too. Well deserved, that is also. Jean is a long-standing member of BSI's B559 Committee for Accessible and Inclusive Environments. Thank you for that too, Jean. And is the BSI's technical author for PAS 6463, which she's going to tell us about today. Jean, over to you. I can make sure I'm really quick at the end, so you take a bit more time that you need to give us a full presentation. Over to you, and thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to introduce neurodiversity and go through the structure of the PAS 6463, and then we'll look at a few examples of the chapters and finish some Q&A. So very mindful of some of the things that have already been said by Mike about how much effort goes into some of these standards, so I will touch upon that as well. So what is neurodiversity? The variation in our neurocognitive profile varies across the whole population. So we don't come in a one-size-fits-all physically any more than we do with brain type. So if you fit a societal norm, so an average, you may be described as neurotypical in this way, but there are many natural and normal genetic variations around this. So basically, if you look at a group of people, we are going to be neurodiverse. We have diversity in our neurological profiles. So we all think and process information in a slightly different way. And for some people, that variation is very different. So I have a little graph here at the top right, and you will see a blue dotted line running through it. That is a person who never exists. That, if that person existed, they were completely the same in their ability for everything. So they would have a kind of a norm line for, you know, maths, English, sports, dance, absolutely everything. Of course, they don't exist. Most of us will have something more like the yellow line, which you can see is slightly undulating zigzag. So a slight variation. I might be better at English than I am at science, and so on and so forth. Where someone is neurodivergent, they won't meet that kind of band of neurological typical that we find in society, and they will have much more of variation. So that green line with as deeper zigzags is really what I'm talking about. So where between their strengths and perhaps their weaknesses or their challenges, there will be much more difference. And this affects how someone thinks and processes information. It can apply to learning new things or how you communicate, finding your way and navigating from A to B, and generally how you experience the world as well. So neurodiversity, everyone, neurotypical, not that spiky profile, and neurodivergent is not fitting that majority neurotypical model. And then there's neurodegenerative is another term you might hear, and that's really someone not born with a neurodivergent trait or condition, but someone who has acquired a progressive condition over time, such as dementia or Parkinson's, etc. So basically, our brains are not in neat compartments, and we do like to put people in boxes with labels. So I've got a few here: ADHD, we've got dyspraxia, dyslexia, and autism, and so on. But even within the autistic community, there's a huge variation in how that trait affects them. So we're all basically messy and all neurodiverse, and we've tried to avoid too much of the labeling when we looked at the PAS standard. The main thing that we're trying to resolve or to make better with this standard is people who have sensory processing differences, and in particular have hypersensitivity to the environment around them. So for some people might be very sensitive to noise in different ways, or lighting, and some people might be very, very sensitive to everything that the senses experience. So sense of smell, sense of touch, everything. And what this hypersensitivity can do is it can cause sensory overload during the course of the day or by one incident. So it can affect your heart rate, your breathing, your blood pressure, it can cause confusion. In many, many cases, it causes anxiety and mental distress, and then in turn can affect some behaviour. Around 70% of people who have a diagnosed neurodivergent condition are believed to be hypersensitive So they experience things too intensely. And the remaining 30% can be hyposensitive, in that they are undersensitive and therefore will seek out bright colours and additional sensory stimulation, touch and noise and so on. When we've looked at the built environment, what we've said is, look, really it's the hypersensitivity that we should try and fix or make better, because that is the one where we're pushing people into sensory overload. Whereas when you're hypersensitive, you have some control over that yourself. You can wear fidget jewelry, you can have fidget items in your key ring and so on. You can plonk items on your desk in front of you or wear colourful clothing. There are other ways of getting that sensory stimulation. Whereas when you experience sensory overload or the higher sensitivity, it's very, very difficult to shut out this bombardment on the senses on a day-to-day basis. What we've found during the development of the PAS is that many people who experience some of these challenges don't have a formal diagnosis for any sensory processing condition or difference. So they're either undiagnosed, or they might be like me. I'm neurotypical, but I have spikes in one or two areas. And I didn't actually kind of realise I could apply this to myself until I became technical author and started working with so many experts. And there are other conditions, I believe, and have come to light, that are often unknowingly affected by elements of building. So examples would include some migraine sufferers who know that lighting can cause it, but that they perhaps weren't aware of that having a hypersensitivity to it. And people with vestibular conditions, such as balance conditions like Meniere's, which my husband's got, who for years have known that certain patterns or certain frequency of noise can trigger an attack. So we've arrived at this PAS 6463, designed for the mind, neurodiversity in the built environment. And it was identified some years ago, actually, by the B559 committee, which is the one that Ant mentioned, that looks after access and the BS 8300 standards, that, you know, we're not doing enough in this area. And in 2016, BSI did commission some research by Helen Hamlin Society, and that was a very qualitative piece of research, very, very good. Lots of first-hand feedback from people with a variety of conditions who explained how the environment impacted on them negatively, and that included, you know, lighting and noise and so on. So in 2018, the BS 8300 does incorporate some high-level recommendations around this, because we had the benefit of that feedback. But then in 2019, the PAS commenced its journey, and we had, as usually the case with the PAS, we have sponsors, Transport for London, with a first and foremost and major sponsor. Bureau Hackwood sponsored my involvement as technical author, and my client BBC Workplace were very happy to contribute as well, because they have many neurodivergent employees, and they recognise this was a really, really important area to know more about. And for both flooring, any floor finish is quite often a massive area and can have potentially massive impact on our senses. So it can have a very calming environment, or it can be very exciting, and it can also cause sensory overload if we don't get it right. So those are the sponsors. And as many of you will know in this audience particularly, that a PAS is a publicly available specification. That's what it stands for. And it's a first step. It's a toe in the water, if you like, towards a formal standard. It's generally produced very quickly, sometimes just a matter of months. It has technical author, which in this case is me. And I've worked with an expert steering group, and we've also had input from a wider invited review panel. The number 6463, you choose a number when you develop a PAS, a number that's available, of course, and 6463 spelt out mind, so that's what we chose. That's what the front cover looks like. Its scope is new and existing mainstream buildings and external environments. And I have to say that the steering group, apart from their professional experiences, which was extraordinary across so many strands, also many of them had lived experience as well of living with a neurodivergent or neurodegenerative condition. Those people and those organisations are listed in the forward as usual, so you can find out more about them. There was very significant interest in this standard during the public consultation from both professionals and also consumers, and many, many hundreds of people with neurodivergent conditions who've been waiting a long time to see the built environment improve. So who will benefit? Well, everyone and anyone, I think. There are times when we will all benefit from some of the advice and recommendations in this standard. It's likely to be, you know, a very broad spectrum in neurological sensory processing differences. And we've avoided, where possible, sort of mentioned diagnosis or labels. And that's because we couldn't capture every single label and we were sure to leave someone out, but also we didn't want people to dismiss it as saying, oh, that's only about autism, it's only about ADHD. It's very overlapping. Many of these experiences are the same for many conditions. So the scope covers design and management, has to be both really. And the target audiences, of course, are anyone who's designing, so architects, designers, planners, town planners, facility managers who are running the buildings, any decision maker, employers, even occupational therapists who are trying to help people, you know, in their home or their workplace, trying to deal with some of these challenges. The content, therefore, is most building types in mainstream provision. We don't feel that we've covered enough or gone deep enough for things like a dementia care home, or possibly some areas in a specialist educational needs environment such as school. However, I think there's still a lot they could take away from this standard in the common areas, for example. This is the contents list, so there's 15 parts to it, and we've basically followed a structure that you would follow from concept through to completion of a building, if that makes sense. We've got a couple of annexes in there, one particularly around additional. We've got management spread throughout, management type issues that come up, as well as design throughout the document, but we've also got a concerted effort on management in Annex A, and we've got a checklist around quiet and restorative spaces. Really, really important component of this standard, actually. And then Annex C has just got some symbols that have come from another standard in BSI that it's been discontinued, but we felt were worthy of repeating, so we've brought them in here. So although the standard isn't purely about new build, we followed the structure from a new build kind of concept stage, and we've got right early on about developing the brief, strategy and commitment you might have to this, how you engage stakeholders. So it's very important that people have a voice, and quite often on this one, we have found that it's less likely that people with neurodifference have been included in at the table. So that's been part of the problem. And we've linked to the plan of work. So you can see here, I've got the REBA plan of work. We've got the normal stages here. And we've kind of said how this design for the mind activities will impact and what you need to think about at each stage, because we thought the architects would find that structure quite helpful. We looked at also external, so site and building layout, and the importance of, you know, the facade design. So it was quite interesting working with our own facades team at Bureau Hubbard on some of this. You know, some of the designs that can be on an external facade can be very patterned. They can cause reflection and glare. They can cause heat gain. So there can be issues around some of that. Also, the orientation of the building can help or hinder wayfinding and navigation. And the ability to have good sight lines and windows and views in and out can also be very, very helpful to people experiencing anxiety. And the wayfinding section is quite big. We start looking at advanced information and preview. So you can imagine, if you are someone who experiences this hypersensitivity, you will want to know about the type of environment you're going into so that you can know what to expect. And that helps many, many people to actually, it's a coping mechanism to help them to kind of deal with what's going on. So advanced information, either through a website or literature or a preview, even through a window, being able to see the room beyond and so on, can really, really help. We looked at things like attentional bias, which I think is quite well known in wayfinding circles, that once you introduce a concept of, you know, signage, for example, if you suddenly change halfway through a building to a different style and shape and colour, that can really affect some people, to the effect that they don't see it at all, because they're looking, the brain is filtered out and is only looking for a particular style of sign. They've also looked at the role of technology in supporting wayfinding, which I think is is really coming along in leaps and strides now. So it's a good thing to look at. We looked at external spaces and access to nature. We obviously, as humans, have an innate affinity with nature, and we do this through either being in green space or outside, or with touching and feeling and being able to view other natural materials or views that are akin to nature. So it could be images of green space and rivers and mountains and so on, or it could be a real view of the real thing. All very, very important, the biophilic design aspect to this. We looked at internal layouts, so how people transition between spaces, and sometimes the barriers can be when you move from one type of space to another, so that's an important consideration, as well as the layout and symmetry, the orderliness, if you like, of a space. So trying to reduce some of the clutter. We don't want things to be bland and sparse and feel institutionalized, but equally that any items that are in there need to kind of feel like they've got some symmetry and order to them. And the familiarity and clarity and orientation of space can play a really, really important, helpful part in this. One of the key things in the PAS is about giving people some control, if you like. And part of control might not be necessarily about throwing a switch, but it can also be about choosing where you go and where you sit and where you work from, or where you occupy a particular environment. So having different types of space is really, really helpful when we can. I mean, we recognise that every building can do this. One of the areas I think that has more in it than I was expecting to have at the outset is this one. So we called it mechanical, electrical and plumbing, MEP, and we've put in there anything to do with the kind of the switch and the switching and control of the environment, and also things that might be related to it. So it's when a lot of procurement around this as well. So when you buy a carpet or you decide to introduce cleaning substances and things like that, we need to be very careful. If people have a really acute sense of smell, this can be really, really uncomfortable and distressing. And we all know about formaldehyde and off-gassing from carpets and things like that in the early days. So part of this will be about management and kind of sending through fresh air to refresh the environment as well. There was a connection here with COVID as well. We realised as the project went on, because this was very much a PAS developed during COVID, and that people did lose their sense of smell, but some people also were left with a very enhanced, if you like, sense of smell, which is not always a good thing and can also be very distressing. So there are people with long COVID that have a really, really heightened sense of olfaction. Acoustics and noise and lighting, I think, were probably the biggest areas of concern raised in the Helen Hamlin Society initial research, and we've certainly found that has been the case as we've gone on and on. So the ability to adjust to a variation in noise levels in someone who's neurodivergent can be very different because they have that hypersensitivity in the first place. So acoustic layout and zoning will really help, and offering different options, like this is a collaborative zone, this is a quiet zone, and so on. We did take some criteria from other standards, of course, wherever we could, we did. And the building bulletins for schools were one of those, particularly the stuff around SEN education and some of the acoustic values there, which we feel would be more helpful in all schools, actually, because someone with a neurodivergent condition may not necessarily go to a special educational needs school. And education actually was found to be one of the very key building types, education and transport, that are the most challenging for people with hypersensitivity. And we had input we had Ecofon, a lady from Ecofon on the steering group who'd also studied dementia studies, so that's really useful. I had Bureau Happold Acoustics I could work with, and the steering group had other members as well with lots of interest in this. It's a really key area for us. So obviously noise can affect physiological and psychological impact, and most of us that are neurotypical can adjust to some variation in levels, but it is going to be much, much harder, and that can cause sensory overload, stress, anxiety, etc. There was a huge variation that came to light on what people are sensitive to as well. So some people might be more susceptible to continuous noise, others intermittent. So I can definitely, for example, filter out continuous noise, but intermittent noise is more annoying. Unexpected noise, such as sudden loud crashes and things like that, or sirens going off, are intrusive for many people, but not all. Some people just don't like a high volume of noise, and some people it's for specific frequencies. So softer sounds such as a continuous hum or ticking clock or dripping tap can be incredibly annoying. So introducing absorptive materials such as carpets, finishes, soft close lids to toilet seats and cupboards and so on, or quiet flushes, quieter and low noise appliances such as you can get lower noised kettles, washing machines, etc., and hand dryers as well were a key issue. And we realised from the hand dryer situation that many young children have hypersensitive hearing and can hear frequencies much more intensely than an adult can. So is it acceptable to have really high noise environments that children have to put their hands over their ears sort of thing? In some shared environments, therapeutic recorded sounds may be beneficial, but not everyone will tolerate those. So it is really about talking to users as well. And a really silent environment might be better suited to a few, but for most people, total silence is unhelpful. And most people want a little bit of background noise. Otherwise, you become very susceptible to hearing even the tiniest thing. Loads on lighting, so daylight, glare and shadows, all potentially of interest and concern. We looked at flicker rates, and there was a myth, I think, when we started that fluorescent was always going to be worse than LED in flicker terms and intolerance. That's not the case at all. What we've discovered is that the LED needs to be very carefully designed with appropriate driver types and so on. And there is a linked piece of work that we've done with the NDTI on lighting and in healthcare where this particularly came up. So in terms of, we look at types and levels and avoiding over specification. Incandescent lighting, so our old type of lighting, actually often preferred by people who are neurodivergent and hypersensitive, but of course we can't go backwards in and get that type of lighting anymore. So that's an interesting area for research, I think. We looked at illumination ratios, so for example, where you're currently working or sitting, and then when you move away from that, and if the ratio is too great, that can cause this quite a startling effect. And we looked at color rendering index. So this is the reality look of colors from artificial lighting, and you can see here this is a better value here for the half of this fruit bowl, and there's the other half, and that can particularly affect some people with facial recognition and so on. Generally, the lighting that most people who are hypersensitive, they preferred a warmer tone. So still a white light, but it's a warmer white. And then the cooler, which we know raises our alertness and helps with concentration, the bluer type light, can become very, very intrusive and can cause this sensory overload. So the follow-on piece of work that we did was this one with the NDTI, and looking at variable colour temperatures for places that had 24/7 occupation, where you might actually be sleeping or recovering. So hospital wards, living accommodation, hotels and so on, or student hostels, where they might want the cool light when they're trying to study late at night, try and keep them awake, but actually generally might benefit more from the warmer when they do want to go to sleep. So I think there's things in this lighting section that may impact other standards as well, potentially going forward. And let's just slide around those color temperatures. When you're in the blue zone, basically, you're much more likely to disrupt someone's circadian rhythm or sleep cycles if someone was in that zone and it wasn't the appropriate time. So for example, if you had that light in the evening. I think we've also got to consider light pollution. So if you have LED lights, street lights, which can be whiter now and a cooler color than the old type, that might affect some people's sleep patterns, particularly if we can't block out the light enough from windows and curtains and blinds. So adaptational lighting is particularly helpful in this group, and particularly for people with dementia or seasonal affective disorder as well. And I think that can help people to acclimatise and overcome it. It's not lighting per se is a problem. I think it's poorly designed or not designed with this in mind. It's where the issue lies. And then when we move to surface finishes, of course, that works in connection with lighting. So the light hits the surface and can bounce off. So we were, we have some content in there about reflection and glare off of surfaces, but also looking at the colours themselves. So not dictating what colours you can have per se, but to say if someone is sitting with a colour in their peripheral field, a large amount of colour in their peripheral field for any length of time, such as in a meeting room, you really should try and make that more muted rather than vivid, because it can be very dominant on the senses. There's a piece here around adjacent floor surfaces, and this came from University of Stirling and their work on dementia, which is saying that for someone with Parkinson's or dementia not to move from one flooring type to another that is adjacent on the floor without having some form of freeze where the body feels it can't step over it. It's a kind of barrier. It really needs to be lower than 10 LRV. So it's a very low level of contrast, really. But generally, we haven't worried too much about this in the past if it's meant to be an indicative pathway or something. We looked at floor and wall patterns, so the student input from UCL around hotel wall patterns, carpet patterns, and so on, but also looking at the configuration of tiling and how they're laid out. So you can have a floor tile, for example, that doesn't look as though it's going to cause any problem, but if you tessellate it, so you start rotating some of those tiles, you can end up with quite a dominant pattern. But a lot of this depends on the level of visual contrast in the pattern itself, and also whether it's a very linear pattern or whether it's a biophilic, which happens more in nature. And the biophilic patterns generally are less intrusive on the brain, and the brain can dismiss them as not being anything startling. We looked at fixtures, finishes, and furniture, and so on. So this was more about where it's positioned in a space, it's symmetrical. What's the approximation? Have we got enough of a space bubble for people to move around? People with dyspraxia, for example, bump into things a lot, you know, and then you can cause injury or even self-harm on some of these sharp corners. We looked at low noise items, which I've already mentioned, in the fixtures and fittings. Use of natural materials comes back to biophilia again, and just that familiarity and ease of operation. So towards the end, we start looking at safety and recovery, and we do have a piece in there about emergency evacuation and the additional considerations for someone who's neurodivergent. So if you can imagine a fire situation and somebody's senses, they're hypersensitive, you are in a situation that's likely to be very crowded, a lot of bustle, a lot of noise going on from the fire alarms. Sometimes those can be intolerably loud. They might be flashing lights as well. So that whole situation, we feel, is an area of concern and something that needs to be thought about, and certainly on the management processes around evacuating people. We've touched on safe environments and safeguarding, but the bigger section here is this quiet and restorative spaces, which we looked at in some detail, and it was informed by some research, which I'll mention in a moment. Just to say, we didn't look at sensory rooms in a big way. I do have information on sensory rooms I could have put in, but we felt that the majority of the study was more about the hypersensitivity, and the sensory room is one where you go to be stimulated, so it quite often has fibre optic strands and things like that, quite often used with younger children and in certain settings such as special education. So this is my colleague Toa. She was a student when we started the PAS, and I was talking to students about neurodiversity, as you would, and she decided to do her research project on autism and how you create a quiet room. Her sister was autistic, so she had familial experience of this, and she translated it into different languages and did an amazing piece of research that's been really helpful to this chapter 14. And I'm pleased to say that Toa is now part of our team at Bureau Happert. Of course, she would snatch someone up like that. So what we've done a deeper dive in this section. So it's a quiet space rather than a sensory room. We talk about how you create them, and having a huge sort of well-being come quiet space isn't always ideal. What you really want is a space where someone can go to feel rescued, to feel like they can quickly reset and recover from a situation. So lots of little rooms generally are better dotted around a big building or dotted around an estate rather than just one, because when someone is hit by this, they can become non-verbal and have kind of sensory shutdown. There's much more in-depth acoustics, lighting, colour, and all of those features I've already mentioned, but a deeper dive in that section. And also the need to give some flexibility. So, for example, if you've got a couple of meeting rooms that are often empty, you can have flexibility that someone could choose to use that as a temporary quiet space in addition. And I think that might be the way some companies have to go with offices, for example. And then Annex B has some support checklist tables, which were also generated by TOA. I wanted to touch on mental health here, because if you're neurodivergent or neurodegenerative, you don't necessarily have poor mental health. It's not a given. However, if you can imagine being hypersensitive and experiencing this daily bombardment on the senses that you are hypersensitive to, you can understand that if that continues for long periods of time, or it's a day-to-day occurrence, that it's going to impact your mental well-being. And I think that's why we are seeing a much higher incidence of mental health conditions amongst the neurodivergent community. So this quiet and restorative space is really, really important. And introducing biophilic design anywhere in the building is always helpful, because it reconnects people with nature, and nature is definitely a calming influence for everyone. On the environment types, we picked these ones out specifically to say a little bit more. And I've already mentioned that transport and education, places where you learn, are particularly important in this design, but that doesn't mean to say the others aren't. Sport and leisure, we've put a section in on there with the input from Sport England, and we've talked about healthcare. These are just a few additional paragraphs, and this one, the living and sleeping accommodation, helpfully had some great input from the occupational therapists for housing. But these are just areas where there's additional pockets of research and information, so it's basically signposting you to other areas that exist outside the PAS. So in summary then, what we're trying to do here is provide an environment to people that has some clarity to it. It kind of makes sense, it's logical, it's not, you know, you can understand the space without too much effort, it's intuitive. An environment that gives you some choice and control, and that control can be going somewhere else or sitting somewhere else, but also switching something or turning something up or down or pulling a blind and so on. And finally, but very, very important, a calm space to escape to when it does become too much or things go wrong. So these were the three kind of umbrella pillars: the calm, the clarity, and the control. And you can see the other elements what we've looked at are in there. This is the infinity symbol, if you haven't come across this before, and this is often used as a symbol for autism and other neurodivergent conditions. And so I think the BBC have actually adopted the infinity symbol to indicate a space that's going to be quieter. So application evaluation, I'm hoping it will be applied to all types of environment, right from external parks through to independent and supported living even. Certainly can see on our own work that there's applications for museums, offices, civic buildings, and so on. And we're pulling it in on refurbishments, because a lot of buildings now, of course, are being repurposed. Application, so not prescriptive, not mandatory, but full of choice and variety that you can look at. Hopefully, you know, humans are neurologically diverse, and we need to take that into consideration. So this is an example from BBC. Love this image, walk past it, not a problem. If you're sitting in the room, might be a bit intrusive. They've got a voile curtain they could pull across. And on other windows, they've managed to put some an opaque layer of film on to tone it down as well. So you get two different views of the same thing. So it can be really easy, quick fix things. So typically this is going to have a 2-year shelf life. It's currently free to download, courtesy of Sport England. BSI are hoping maybe to trial some new feedback mechanisms. So we do want feedback. We want people to try it and apply it and give us feedback and case studies, etc. And hopefully over time, and I might say more on this, can be embedded in either a British standard or an ISO. We couldn't find in our lit review anything anywhere in the world, and certainly people have been contacting me international for this information. So love your case studies. It's been hugely informed by human experience and stories shared, etc., by some amazing experts. So big shout out of thanks to them. We've got lots of links to other documents where you might need them. So I mean, I've 21 years I've been in inclusive design or accessibility, and throughout that time we've been endeavouring to capture diversity of our physical needs. but we've done so much less on sensory and mental health and well-being, and I think this is the time to sit up and look at that. We don't operate in isolation from our environment, whether physically, mentally or emotionally. And if you wanted to grow a beautiful garden, you'd expect it to have different plants that needed different watering mechanisms, different amounts of shade and sunlight and feed and everything else. So, you know, that's just plants and flowers. Why would we expect humans to all be the same? Of course we're not. So hopefully this is just the start of a long journey to recognizing our uniqueness. So back to Ant for Q&A, and I've just put some ways to keep in touch. Thank you.
Brilliant presentation. Thank you, Jean. If you want to just flick your camera on and join me, I'm mindful of the time, but I think you'll all agree, those of you currently watching and enjoying the presentation we've just seen from Jean, I think it's, you know, it's something that of late, health and safety in the purest sense has gotten the lion's share of parliamentary designers' time. It is important, but we cannot underestimate the impact and the importance of robust, informed, good design for people's well-being. And this is a brilliant piece of work, and you're to be commended, Jean, as technical author, and all those that supported you in the development of the PAS. I suppose, from my perspective, it's only when you sit down and take it all in that you realise it is about an informed piece of design. But actually, when you touch upon products and lighting conditions and spaces, this is very much what we'd call a horizontal standard. This is as pertinent to construction products as it is to design, it cuts across. So I think my commitment, I believe my commitment to you is that we'll discuss this further to see how we can roll it out across BSI more generally and the sectors and subsectors. In terms of the questions, I am very mindful of the time, and I will be quite clear. We'll send a link out with Jean's presentation too, that you can actually download the PAS free at point of download. So please do make use of it. A question I was going to ask you anyway, but it's come in by a couple of people, is, I mean, in terms of what you've just set out here, what more can we do collectively? I've set off about BSI. What more can we do collectively about getting the message out about this PAS? And how would you like to see it used? And what sort of approaches would you be keen for us to take forward as an industry to get this landed?
It's a tricky one. I mean, we had DLUC represented on the steering group, which is helpful, and they were huge buy-in there from them. But I think if the evaluation of it is just key for me, that we apply it and evaluate in so many different types of circumstances. So, for example, I've started already applying it in certain circumstances, and I can see that different clients and different types of organisation with different types of people will apply it slightly differently. They might go the whole hog on one thing and somewhat less on another, because they can't for a particular group. So I think we need that feedback to make sure that when it goes into a standard and does that transition, it's even more informed. And I think there's some pockets also that we would like everyone to start looking at and thinking, actually, there's a bit of research needed that. So I'm trying to push it out to UCL and the students there, but if anyone else is on this call or from a university or a learning environment, if they could do the same, because I think under all of those 16 headings, you could do so much more as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in case people want to drop us a line and come back into the team, if we can gather contacts, we'll do that. Just very quickly, and then I will have to conclude, and I promise we'll do some more of these events, Jean. You mentioned within, and this is a question that's come through, you mentioned within your presentation that, you know, looking to the future already, and we've just got what we've got, what more you'd want to do. And you mentioned care homes and school establishments. What sort of aspects were you thinking about that we need to provide guidance on in those particular instances?
I think some of the there's quite a lot of dementia care type guidance out there, but it's not always aligned. So it would be quite nice for someone to have a look at that. I think there's a lot that could be done around, the more could be done around temperature. So we haven't really covered temperature in a big way in the standard, and that came up right at the 11th hour, that the temperature of an environment might affect someone. Right. Okay. And there is some research going on, so I've asked for that to come back in, because it looked as though when the temperature goes up, the impact of the neurodivergence gets worse. So it's interesting from a sustainability point of view and energy saving. you know, maybe we should be taking our meetings, our rooms down a little bit, and maybe putting that scarf on and so on.
Right.
Yeah, so
Wow.
some interesting stuff there.
Lots of pushes and pulls. I'm going to have to draw a line there, but we will talk more, Jim, I promise, and we'll get you to present more too. So thank you ever so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that brings us to the end of this morning's session. From me, I hope you found it very useful and thought-provoking of what's been going on in our very busy built environment sector. I suggest if we can knock it on one more slide, please. Please do provide the feedback for today's session. I know I've overrun by 5 minutes, but hopefully you agree it was worth it. If you want to see what other events we are running in the built environment space, there's a link there, and this will be sent to you also. We do monthly webinars in terms of the built environment BSI team, but we also have a partnership with the IFE, Institution of Fire Engineers, and we're running typically bi-monthly webinars with them as well. So see what takes your fancy. As I said, this was session 1 of 4 sessions. We've got cyber physical this afternoon, quality and value and modern methods of construction tomorrow. Please go to the same website. You can download and actually make sure you can register for those events later today and tomorrow. It'd be great to have you. In terms of our first event for 2023, well, we're going to kick it off talking about BSI standards and what we're doing to support you, our external important stakeholders, whereby myself and the team will be taking you through what we'll be working on next year we want to make you aware of. Other than that, it's a big thank you. It's a thank you to all of our speakers today. It's a thank you to you for making the time to come and join us and to listen to what I hope you found to be thought-provoking and useful presentations. I certainly have. And it's a big thank you to the events team at BSI, because notwithstanding technical difficulties, this cannot happen without them. They're amazing. And so a big thank you to them too. Have a good rest of the day, and hopefully we'll see you a little bit later at one of our other webinars. Goodbye for now.